At least that was how she put it, though she may not have said everything she had in mind. But while the new Nastasia Philippovna was laughing and explaining all this, Afanasy Ivanovich was thinking the matter over to himself and, as far as possible, putting his somewhat shattered thoughts in order. This thinking went on for some time. For almost 2 weeks he grappled with it and tried to reach a final decision, but after 2 weeks his decision was taken. The thing was that Afanasy Ivanovich was about 50 at that time, and he was in the highest degree a respectable and settled man. His position in the world and in society had long been established on a most solid foundation. He loved and valued himself, his peace, and his comfort more than anything in the world, as befitted a man decent in the highest degree. Not the slightest disturbance, not the slightest wavering, could be tolerated in what had been established by his entire life and had acquired such a beautiful form. On the other hand, his experience and profound insight into things told Totsky very quickly and with extraordinary sureness that he now had to do with a being who was completely out of the ordinary, that this was precisely the sort of being who would not merely threaten, but would certainly act, and above all would decidedly stop at nothing, the more so as she valued decidedly nothing in the world, so that it was even impossible to tempt her. Here, obviously, was something else, implying some heartful and soulful swill, like some sort of romantic indignation, God knows against whom or why, some insatiable feeling of contempt that leaps completely beyond measure, in short, something highly ridiculous and inadmissible in decent society, something that was a sheer punishment from God for any decent man to encounter. To be sure, with Totsky's wealth and connections, it was possible to produce some small and totally innocent villainy at once, so as to be rid of this trouble. On the other hand, it was obvious that Nastasia Philippovna herself was scarcely capable of doing any harm. For instance, in the legal sense, she could not even cause a significant scandal, because it would always be too easy to limit her. But all that was so only in case Nastasia Philippovna decided to act as everyone generally acts in such cases, without leaping too eccentrically beyond measure. But it was here that Totsky's keen eye also proved useful. He was able to perceive that Nastasia Philippovna herself understood perfectly well how harmless she was in the legal sense, but that she had something quite different in mind and in her flashing eyes. Valuing nothing, and least of all herself, it took great intelligence and perception to guess at that moment that she had long ceased to value herself and, skeptic and society cynic that he was, to believe in the seriousness of that feeling. Nastasia Philippovna was capable of ruining herself, irrevocably and outrageously, facing Siberia and hard labor, if only she could wreak havoc on the man for whom she felt such inhuman loathing. Afanasy Ivanovitch had never concealed the fact that he was somewhat cowardly or, better to say, conservative in the highest degree. If he knew, for instance, that he would be killed at the foot of the altar, or that something of that sort would happen, extremely improper, ridiculous, and socially unacceptable, he would of course be frightened, but not so much at being killed or gravely wounded, or having his face publicly spat in, and so on and so forth, as at it happening to him in such an unnatural and unacceptable form. And this was precisely what Nastasia Philippovna foretold, though so far she had been silent about it. He knew that she understood and had studied him to the highest degree, and therefore knew how to strike at him. And since the wedding was indeed only an intention, Afanasy Ivanovitch humbled himself and yielded to Nastasia Philippovna. Another circumstance contributed to this decision. It was difficult to imagine how little this new Nastasia Philippovna resembled the former one in looks. Formerly she had been merely a very pretty girl, but now, for a long time Totsky could not forgive himself that he had looked for 4 years and not seen. True, it means much when an upheaval occurs on both sides, inwardly and unexpectedly. However, he recalled moments, even before, when strange thoughts had come to him. For instance, while looking into those eyes, it was as if he had sensed some deep and mysterious darkness in them. Those eyes had gazed at him, and seemed to pose a riddle. During the last 2 years he had often been surprised by the change in Nastasia Philippovna's color. She was growing terribly pale and, strangely, was even becoming prettier because of it. Totsky, who, like all gentlemen who have had a bit of fun in their time, at first looked with scorn on this untried soul he had obtained for himself so cheaply, more recently had begun to doubt his view. In any case, he had already resolved that past spring to arrange a marriage for Nastasia Philippovna before too long, in an excellent and well-provided way, with some sensible and respectable gentleman serving in a different province. Oh, how terribly and wickedly Nastasia Philippovna laughed at that now, but now Afanasy Ivanovitch, charmed by the novelty, even thought he might again make use of this woman. He decided to settle Nastasia Philippovna in Petersburg and surround her with luxurious comfort. If not the one thing, then the other, he could show Nastasia Philippovna off and even boast of her in a certain circle. And Afanasy Ivanovitch cherished his reputation along that line. 5 years of Petersburg life had already gone by, and, naturally, in such a period many things had become clear. Afanasy Ivanovitch's position was ungratifying. Worst of all was that, having once turned coward, he could never afterwards be at peace. He was afraid, and did not even know why. He was simply afraid of Nastasia Philippovna. For some time, during the first 2 years, he began to suspect that Nastasia Philippovna wanted to marry him herself, but said nothing out of her extraordinary vanity and was stubbornly waiting for him to propose. It would have been a strange pretension. Afanasy Ivanovitch scowled and pondered heavily. To his great end, such is man's heart, rather unpleasant amazement, he had occasion suddenly to become convinced that even if he had proposed, he would not have been accepted. For a long time he could not understand it. Only one explanation seemed possible to him, that the pride of the insulted and fantastic woman had reached such frenzy that she found it more pleasant to show her contempt once by refusing than to define her position forever and attain an unattainable grandeur. The worst of it was that Nastasia Philippovna had gained the upper hand terribly much. She also would not yield to mercenary interests, even if the interests were very great, and though she accepted the offered comfort, she lived very modestly and in those 5 years saved almost nothing. Afanasy Ivanovitch risked another very clever means of breaking his fetters. he began inconspicuously and artfully to tempt her, being skillfully aided, with various ideal temptations, but the incarnate ideals, princes, hussars, embassy secretaries, poets, novelists, even socialists, nothing made any impression on Nastasia Philipovna, as if she had a stone in place of a heart, and her feeling had dried up and died out once and for all. She lived a largely solitary life, read, even studied, liked music. She had very few acquaintances. She kept company with some poor and ridiculous wives of officials, knew 2 actresses, some old women, was very fond of the numerous family of a certain respectable teacher, and this family was very fond of her and received her with pleasure. In the evening she quite often had gatherings of 5 or 6 acquaintances, not more. Totsky came very often and punctually. More recently General Epanchin, not without difficulty, had made Nastasia Philipovna's acquaintance. At the same time, quite easily and without any difficulty, a young clerk named Ferdishchenko had made her acquaintance, a very indecent and salacious buffoon, with a pretense to gaiety and a penchant for drink. She was also acquainted with a strange young man by the name of Tin, modest, neat, and sleek, who had risen from destitution and become a moneylender. Gavrila Ardalionovich, too, finally made her acquaintance. It ended with Nastasia Philipovna acquiring a strange fame. Everyone knew of her beauty, but only that, no one had anything to boast of, no one had anything to tell. This reputation, her cultivation, elegant manners, wit, all this finally confirmed Afanasy Ivanovich in a certain plan. And it was at this moment that General Epanchin himself began to take such an active and great part in the story. When Totsky so courteously turned to him for friendly advice concerning one of his daughters, he at once, in the noblest fashion, made a most full and candid confession. He revealed that he had already resolved to stop at nothing to gain his freedom, that he would not be at peace even if Nastasia Philipovna herself declared to him that henceforth she would leave him entirely alone, that words were not enough for him, and he wanted the fullest guarantees. They came to an understanding and decided to act together. At first they determined to try the gentlest ways and to touch, so to speak, only on the noble strings of the heart. They both went to Nastasia Philippovna, and Totsky began straight off with the unbearable horror of his position. He blamed himself for everything. He said frankly that he was unable to repent of his initial behavior with her, because he was an inveterate sensualist and not in control of himself, but that now he wanted to marry, and the whole fate of this most highly respectable and society marriage was in her hands, in short, that he placed all his hopes in her noble heart. Then General Epanchin began to speak in his quality as father, and spoke reasonably, avoiding emotion, mentioning only that he fully recognized her right to decide Afanasy Ivanovitch's fate, deftly displaying his own humility, pointing out that the fate of his daughter, and perhaps of his two other daughters, now depended on her decision. To Nastasia Philippovna's question. Precisely what did they want of her? Totsky, with the same perfectly naked candor, admitted to her that he had been so frightened 5 years ago that even now he could not be entirely at peace until Nastasia Philippovna herself had married someone. He added at once that this request would, of course, be absurd on his part, if he did not have some grounds in this regard. He had noted very well and had positive knowledge that a young man of very good name, and living in a most worthy family, Gavrila Ardalionovich of Volgin, whom she knew and received in her house, had long loved her with all the force of passion and would certainly give half his life just for the hope of obtaining her sympathy.